It began not in a war room or a laboratory, but under the endless skies of the American Southwest, in the dry red canyons of Arizona, where the wind carried words that had no written form. To the outside world, it was an ancient language, strange, melodic, untranslatable. To those who spoke it, it was life itself. It was Navajo. No one then could have imagined that this language, spoken by shepherds and elders around desert fires, would one day decide battles thousands of miles away, across oceans, jungles, and islands scarred by war. But in 1941, the world changed. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, the Pacific exploded into chaos. Within weeks, the American fleet lay crippled, and the Empire of Japan advanced like a tidal wave through the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island. Every American transmission that crossed the airwaves became a matter of survival, and the Japanese were listening. From the beginning, Japan had one of the most sophisticated code-breaking operations in the world. Its cryptographers, trained mathematicians and linguists, had already cracked several Allied ciphers. The Americans, desperate to maintain secrecy, changed systems again and again, but the Japanese always caught up. By 1942, radio operators in the Pacific were transmitting under constant threat. Every message risked interception. Every delay in decoding cost lives. The U.S. needed a code the enemy couldn't break, something faster, safer, and utterly beyond comprehension. But the more they searched, the clearer it became. No code made by men could remain unbroken forever. Until someone realized, maybe the answer wasn't a code at all. The idea came from an unlikely source, Philip Johnston, a 53-year-old civil engineer and World War I veteran. He wasn't a cryptographer or a soldier. He was the son of a missionary who had lived among the Navajo people since childhood. Johnston spoke their language fluently, and he knew something that the generals didn't. The Navajo language was unlike any other on Earth. It had no alphabet, no written form, and was spoken by fewer than 9 non-Navajos in the entire world. Its grammar was complex, its tonality subtle. The same word could change meaning with a shift in inflection. Even within the tribe, certain ceremonial terms were known only to the initiated. To an outsider, it was as indecipherable as smoke in the wind. To Johnston, it was perfect. In February 1942, Johnston requested a meeting at Camp Elliott near San Diego. There, in a small office crowded with maps of the Pacific, he made his pitch to a group of skeptical Marine officers. He explained how a spoken language, used naturally, not written or encoded, could serve as an unbreakable form of encryption. Messages could be transmitted instantly without the need for codebooks or machines. The officers frowned. It sounded absurd, until Johnston proposed a demonstration. He arranged for 2 Navajo speakers to sit in one room, connected by field radio to another pair in a different building. A random English message was written on a slip of paper and handed to the first Navajo. He listened, nodded, and began to speak. The words flowed in a rhythm that sounded like music, fast, fluid, alien. On the other end, the second Navajo translated back into English. The entire process took 20 seconds. The same message, sent using the Army's top cipher machine, took half an hour. The room went silent. Then one of the officers muttered, almost to himself, "Gentlemen, we may have just found our code." A week later, Johnston received authorization to recruit a test group, 29 Navajo men, all bilingual, young, and fit enough to serve in the Marines. He traveled across the reservations of Arizona and New Mexico, explaining the mission in church basements, trading posts, and schools. For many of the recruits, the U.S. government had once been their people's enemy, the same government that had taken their lands, banned their language, and forced their children into English-only boarding schools. And now, that same government was asking for their voices. Still, they volunteered, not out of loyalty to Washington, but out of something deeper, a sense of honor, of protecting the land that held their ancestors' bones. As one recruit said, "This land is our mother. If she's in danger, we fight." By May 1942, the first 29 reported to Camp Pendleton for training. Their hair was cut, their names replaced by serial numbers, and their bodies drilled into shape by Marine sergeants who could not pronounce a single one of their names. But when the sun set and the desert winds cooled the camp, something extraordinary happened. Inside a tent, by the light of a single lamp, the Navajo recruits began to create a code, not a cipher, but a language within their language. They started with the alphabet, using words familiar to them to represent letters. Ant for A, bear for B, cat for C. Then they built words for military concepts that had no equivalent in Navajo. Turtle for tank, shark for submarine, hummingbird for fighter plane, egg for bomb, iron fish for battleship. Within weeks, they had crafted a working system, one that could transmit any message imaginable using native metaphor and instinctive fluency. The Marines watched in awe. The Navajo recruits weren't just translating English, they were reinventing it. When the system was tested again, the results were staggering. An encoded field message that once took hours could now be sent, received, and decoded in seconds, with zero errors. More importantly, the enemy had no chance of breaking it. Even if they intercepted the transmission, even if they recorded it, even if they played it back 1,000 times, it would mean nothing. Because what the Navajo had built wasn't a code made of numbers and symbols. It was alive. As 1942 wore on and the war darkened across the Pacific, the Marines prepared for their first major counterattack, Guadalcanal. The Japanese dominated the air, sea, and intelligence. Every American advantage had been stripped away. But this time, when the Marines landed, they would carry a secret unlike any in history. Not in a book, not in a machine, but in the minds and voices of men who came from the red canyons of Arizona. The Japanese could break every cipher, they could read every message, but they had never heard this one. The war was about to hear the sound of an unbreakable language. When the 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Pendleton in the spring of 1942, few of them had ever seen the ocean. They came from mesas and canyons, from small reservations scattered across the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, a world of silence, wind, and sand. Now they stood before the vast gray Pacific, wearing uniforms 2 sizes too big, clutching duffel bags that smelled of canvas and salt. For the first time in their lives, they were not simply Navajo, they were Marines. Boot camp was brutal. Drill instructors barked orders that many of the recruits barely understood. They stumbled through English commands, their accents thick and musical, often drawing laughter or irritation. Yet the same sergeants who mocked them for mispronouncing words would later depend on those same voices to save their lives. The recruits endured it all. The blistering runs, the mud crawls under barbed wire, the shouted insults, with a quiet, steady pride. They had endured worse. Their grandparents had been forced to march hundreds of miles in the Long Walk of 1864, driven from their homeland by bayonet and gunfire. They had survived centuries of erasure. The U.S. government had once tried to silence their language. Now that same government was demanding they use it. One of them, Chester Nez, remembered standing at attention as the instructor screamed, "Why the hell are you smiling, Private?" Chester answered softly, "Because I already know I can't be broken." After completing basic training, the 29 were assigned a new mission, one no Marine had ever received before. Inside a guarded tent near the edge of camp, they met their instructor, Major James Jones, and Philip Johnston, the engineer whose idea had brought them here. On a blackboard behind him were 2 words written in chalk: Navajo Code. "This," Johnston said, "will win the war." The men began the task of building the first ever spoken military code.
They worked in secrecy, under armed guard, forbidden to write anything down. Their language was their memory, and their memories became their weapons. The first problem was translation. Navajo had no words for submarine, battleship, or grenade. But where English lacked poetry, Navajo had abundance. They created new words out of metaphor. Ironfish meant submarine. Hummingbird meant fighter plane. Chicken hawk meant dive bomber. Turtle meant tank. Egg meant bomb. When they needed a word for America, they chose our mother. They designed an entire alphabet based on everyday words. Ant for A, bear for B, cat for C, forming the foundation of an encryption system unlike any other in history. Every syllable, every tone mattered. To an outsider, it sounded like rapid chanting. To a Navajo ear, it was precise, mathematical, and alive. Day after day, they refined the system. I tested it by sending fake battlefield reports across radio channels, decoding them under pressure. They raced against Morse operators and codebook teams, and they won every time. When the Marine brass gathered to witness a full demonstration, the results stunned them. One officer read a complex message from a clipboard. Send reinforcements to Hill 851. Enemy tanks advancing from west need artillery immediately. The Navajo operator listened, nodded, and spoke swiftly into the radio. Cha, ta, dahithahi, lotso, nakai. Seconds later, across the camp, another Navajo received it, repeated it into English, and transmitted the translation. Send reinforcements to Hill 851. Enemy tanks advancing from west need artillery immediately. Total time, 18 seconds. The officer stared at the clock. He said, "Do it again." They did. Same result. "This code," the officer whispered, "can't be broken because it's not a code." Soon, the first 29 became 200, then 400. Young Navajo men flooded into recruiting stations, trading sheep and desert dust for uniforms and rifles. They were trained not only as radio operators, but as full combat Marines, riflemen first, communicators second. They carried carbines, grenades, and radios heavy enough to bow their backs. But above all, they carried a language no enemy could touch. One night in June 1942, Major Jones gathered the original group before they shipped out to the Pacific. The tent was lit by a single lantern. The men sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, the hum of generators outside blending with the sound of the ocean. Jones said quietly, "Gentlemen, when you speak Navajo out there, you'll be carrying America's most guarded secret. If captured, you can't let the enemy learn a single word. Do you understand?" There was silence. Then one Marine, Frank Sosi, replied, "We will die before that happens." They left Camp Pendleton in convoys under cover of darkness, their orders sealed. Most didn't know where they were going, only that their language was now a weapon and that the war was waiting. On the docks of San Diego, as they boarded the ships that would carry them into the Pacific, they looked out over the water. The ocean stretched forever, deep, dark, and unknown. One of them whispered in Navajo, "To'e ina, the water is life." None of them knew how many would return. A few weeks later, deep in the Pacific, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the first American offensive of the war. The Japanese were fierce, disciplined, and listening. Every American transmission was intercepted. But this time, when the Japanese cryptographers tuned their radios, what they heard wasn't English, wasn't Morse, wasn't anything they'd ever encountered. Nahash chida tso dahe thithahi. To them it was gibberish, nonsense. They recorded it, replayed it, studied it for months, and yet not one linguist, not one codebreaker could decipher even a single word. Because what they were hearing wasn't a cipher. It was the heartbeat of a people. Back home, on the mesas of the Navajo Nation, the wind moved through the canyons carrying voices that echoed into eternity. Mothers and fathers sat by fires, unaware that their son's language, The same one their grandparents had been punished for speaking in government schools, was now protecting thousands of lives across the ocean. Their words had become bullets. Their songs had become shields. The Marines had found their secret weapon, and it wasn't made of steel or gunpowder. It was made of syllables and soul. By the end of 1942, a quiet revolution had begun. The Navajo Code Talkers had arrived, untested, unproven, and unstoppable. The enemy didn't know it yet, but the Pacific would soon tremble under a weapon that could never be seen, never be captured, and never be broken. A weapon made of living language.
The Pacific in 1942 was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard. By the time the U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the air smelled of salt, fuel, and decay. The jungle was alive with sound, insects, rain, distant gunfire, and the drone of aircraft overhead. The men crouched in the mud, sweat running down their faces, radios pressed against their chests. And somewhere amid that chaos, a new kind of voice cut through the noise. Nahashchida, tso, dahetihihi. A language that no enemy could understand and that no machine could replicate. The Navajo Code Talkers had entered the war. At first, few Marines knew who these men really were. They looked different, spoke in strange syllables, and carried radios instead of rifles. Some white Marines mistook them for Japanese at a glance, a deadly mistake that led to strict identification procedures and secret passwords. But soon, everyone on Guadalcanal learned one simple truth. When the Navajo spoke, help arrived. Their first combat mission came just days after landing. The Japanese had infiltrated the perimeter during the night. Communication lines were cut, and the front was collapsing under artillery fire. A field commander screamed into his radio for air support, but his coded message jammed halfway through transmission. A Navajo Code Talker, Private First Class Albert Smith, grabbed the handset. He spoke quickly, rhythmically into the receiver. His partner, a mile away, translated the words instantly and relayed the coordinates to artillery. Minutes later, the jungle shook. American shells slammed into the Japanese line, halting the attack. The next morning, a Marine sergeant walked up to Smith, slapped him on the shoulder and said, "I don't know what the hell you said last night, kid, but it worked." From that moment on, the Navajos became indispensable. They were assigned to every Marine regiment in the Pacific, their radios humming day and night. Their transmissions directed bombing raids, reported enemy positions, and coordinated amphibious landings. At a time when standard code systems took hours to encrypt and decrypt, the Navajo messages flew through the air in seconds. An American colonel once timed it. Using machines, 30 minutes. Using Navajo, 20 seconds. He looked up from his stopwatch and muttered, "We just rewrote the rules of war." But speed came with cost. The Code Talkers worked under constant fire, often isolated and hunted. The Japanese knew that killing the radio operator could cripple a Marine unit. Many Navajos died before their transmissions could even be sent. In one incident, on Bougainville, a young Navajo named Carl Gorman was trapped in a foxhole surrounded by enemy troops. His partner was dead, his antenna shot away. Instead of waiting, he crawled into open ground under machine gun fire, reattached the wire, and completed his message. He was wounded twice, but refused evacuation. The airstrike he called in saved his entire platoon. The Japanese intelligence corps soon realized something extraordinary was happening. Their cryptographers, who had broken every American cipher from Manila to Midway, were suddenly faced with a code they couldn't touch. They recorded hours of radio chatter, replayed it in Tokyo, and brought in linguists from every captured colony: Chinese, Korean, Polynesian. No one could identify a single syllable. A frustrated officer finally wrote in his report, "This is not a code. It is the voice of ghosts." The phrase spread through Japanese ranks. Whenever Marines transmitted on open channels, enemy soldiers whispered, "The ghosts are talking again." On the American side, the Navajos became legends. They could transmit messages faster than anyone else, and they never made mistakes. During one night attack, a Marine unit under siege near Henderson Field needed reinforcements immediately. Their coordinates were sent through in Navajo. 20 minutes later, U.S. aircraft strafed the enemy lines to dust. The commanding officer radioed back, "Whatever you're doing, keep talking." But behind the radio static and battlefield triumphs, the Code Talkers carried an invisible weight. They were fighting for a nation that once tried to erase their identity. Many had been beaten as children for speaking Navajo in government schools. Now that same language was saving American lives by the thousands. When the shooting paused, they sometimes sat quietly together, sharing a single cigarette in the mud. They spoke softly of home, of sheep herds and sandstone mesas, of mothers waiting under red skies. Then the radio would crackle, and they'd go back to work. There was no room for pride, only duty. In late 1943, the Marines prepared for the next great push, Bougainville. This time, the Navajos would not just relay orders, they would direct the war itself. As artillery thundered through the jungle, pairs of Navajo Code Talkers sat shoulder to shoulder in shallow pits, radio cables snaking through puddles. They spoke constantly, relaying coordinates, reporting unit movements, calling for medical evacuations. Their hands were blistered, their voices hoarse, but their focus unbroken. The enemy never broke through. Every American counterattack landed precisely where it needed to, because somewhere on the front line, a Navajo had whispered the words that made it happen. When the battle ended, a senior officer walked through the wreckage of the Japanese positions. He stopped beside a code talker still at his radio, uniform stained with blood, headset hanging around his neck. "Son," the officer said, "I've been fighting wars since before you were born, and I've never seen anything like this." The Navajo looked up, eyes tired, and replied quietly, "It's just words, sir, but they are strong words." By the end of 1943, the Navajo Code Talkers had proven themselves beyond question. Their language had carried through rain, fire, and blood, and not a single message had ever been lost or misinterpreted. Word of their success spread quietly through the Pacific ranks. Commanders requested more Navajos for every campaign. The Marine Corps agreed. New recruits were brought in by the hundreds, young men who had grown up sheep herding under the same sun as the first 29. They would soon carry radios across the black sands of Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, each battle bloodier than the last. But that was still ahead. For now, on the rain-soaked jungles of Guadalcanal and Bougainville, the first generation of Code Talkers rested beside their silent radios, the scent of gunpowder and earth thick around them. They had spoken, and the world had listened, without understanding a single word. And in that silence after battle, they realized something extraordinary. Their ancestors' language, once nearly destroyed, had become the most powerful code in modern warfare.
By the dawn of 1944, The war in the Pacific had become a storm of iron and fire. The Marines were island-hopping across oceans littered with wreckage, pushing closer to Japan one blood-soaked beach at a time. The names of those islands, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, would become etched into American memory. And on every one of them, amid the sand, mud, and chaos, a steady voice echoed through the static of radio channels, the sound of Navajo. At Tarawa, the assault began before sunrise. The Japanese garrison was dug in deep, their bunkers layered with coral and steel. When the first wave of Marines hit the reef, hundreds were cut down before they reached the shore. The radios jammed with desperate messages, broken Morse, static, confusion. Then, through the noise, a Navajo voice broke in, calm and clear. Turtle moving north. Iron fish destroyed. Request fire from hummingbird. Translated, tanks advancing north. Submarine destroyed. Request air support. The order traveled up the chain in seconds. Minutes later, American bombers swept over the lagoon, turning the beachhead into a storm of fire. The Marines who survived swore they'd never heard communication move that fast before. For the first time, command in chaos had found harmony through a language born in silence. By mid-1944, the Navajo Code Talkers were no longer an experiment. They were a core weapon of U.S. Marine communications. Over 400 Navajos now served across every major division in the Pacific. They carried their radios through the jungles of Bougainville, the volcanic ridges of Saipan, and the endless heat of Peleliu. They operated in pairs, one transmitting, one receiving, always close to the front line. Their hands never stopped turning the knobs, their mouths never stopped speaking. They could transmit a full field report faster than any cipher machine on Earth. One Marine officer described them as living radios. Another called them miracles with rifles. The Japanese still tried to break them. At Saipan, enemy radio teams intercepted every transmission the Navajos sent. They brought in linguists from captured islands, scholars from Tokyo University, even hired interpreters familiar with dozens of Pacific dialects. Nothing worked. The syllables were unlike anything recorded. The rhythm changed from speaker to speaker, making even repetition impossible to map. The Japanese cryptographers filled pages with phonetic transcriptions, but the meaning was beyond them. When American forces captured one of their intercept operators in 1945, he confessed, "We thought it was a code. Then we realized it wasn't a code at all. It was a voice." The turning point came with Iwo Jima, the most brutal battle the Pacific would ever know. On February 19, 1945, 70,000 Marines stormed the black volcanic sands under the shadow of Mount Suribachi. The beach was a killing field. Japanese machine guns scythed through the waves of landing craft. Smoke blanketed the horizon. Radios jammed, men screamed, officers fell. But in the midst of it all, the Code Talkers worked. 6 Navajo teams were assigned to the front, each carrying a 40-pound field radio. They dug shallow holes for cover, crouched behind wrecked tanks, and began transmitting. Shaw, nada hush dada, mihema hita. Bear advancing. Send reinforcements. Our mother needs help. They spoke faster than anyone could write. Messages flew from the beach to command posts, from command to air support, from artillery to forward units. Over 3 days, they sent over 800 messages without a single error. Major General Howard Connor, who commanded communications at Iwo Jima, later said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." But their heroism was not measured in numbers alone. When a radio was destroyed or jammed, the Navajos ran messages by hand through gunfire. When batteries died, they powered the sets themselves with captured generators, sweating and cursing through the heat. In one instance, Two code talkers, Joe Kelwood and John Brown Jr., were trapped under bombardment for hours. They kept transmitting until the antenna was hit. Then they reassembled it, fingers bleeding, and kept going. They didn't stop until the battle ended. For many of them, victory was a paradox. They had fought and bled for a nation that had once tried to erase them. They had seen white officers salute them on the field, then return home to segregation and silence. They had saved countless lives, yet couldn't tell anyone what they had done. Their mission was top secret. Not even their families were allowed to know. When the war ended, they were simply told, "You were never here, you will never speak of this." So they didn't. They went home quietly, to their reservations, their sheep, their deserts. The code that had saved thousands of lives remained locked in their memories, unspoken, unwritten, just as it had been for centuries. But before that silence descended, they had one last message to send. As the U.S. flag rose over Mount Suribachi, a group of Navajo Code Talkers stood by their radios, mud-caked and exhausted. They looked up at the flag and smiled. One of them keyed his microphone and said in Navajo, "The job is done. Our mother sleeps safely again." The transmission reached command where an officer wrote it down without understanding the words. He didn't need to. The war had been won, and the language that once had no written alphabet had just carried America to victory. In the months that followed, the world changed forever. Japan surrendered, the atomic bombs fell. The war ended. But in the shadows of those earth-shaking events, another legacy remained. One born not of destruction, but of preservation. The Navajo language had survived the battlefield, untouched by machine or cipher. It was the only code in history that had truly lived. When asked years later how it felt to have built something so unbreakable, one code talker, Samuel Holliday, smiled and said, "The Japanese couldn't understand it, the Americans didn't deserve it, but the earth remembered it." The war had ended, but the story of the Code Talkers was not over. Their triumph, their silence, and their forgotten legacy would take decades to surface. For now, the desert wind carried their language back home, to the mesas and canyons that had given it birth.
When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world celebrated. Cities lit up with fireworks, church bells rang across continents, and America welcomed home its heroes with parades, medals, and cheers. But for a small group of Marines, men who had fought in the shadows with radios instead of rifles, there was no parade, no applause, no recognition. The Navajo Code Talkers came home in silence. Their mission had been top secret, their words had won battles, but their names would not be spoken for decades. In the autumn of 1945, the survivors of the Code Talker program were discharged quietly. Most returned to the vast deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, stepping off military trucks onto dusty roads that led back to the same hogans and canyons they'd left 3 years earlier. There were no bands, no reporters, no generals waiting to shake their hands. They simply went home, to sheep herds, to families, to lives interrupted by a war that had needed their language, but not their story. When their children asked, "What did you do in the war?" they smiled and said, "We talked." And that was all. They couldn't tell anyone the truth. The program was still classified, the only wartime code never to have been broken and never to be revealed. For more than 20 years, the world had no idea what they had done. The documents were locked in military archives, their radios gathered dust in warehouses, their achievements vanished into history's quiet corners. In those years, many of the Code Talkers struggled to adjust. Some found work as laborers, ranchers, or teachers. Others battled poverty and trauma. They had fought for freedom, only to return to reservations where electricity and running water were luxuries. One veteran, Chester Nez, later recalled, "I came home proud,
But when I went into town, they told me Indians weren't allowed in certain stores. I had fought for America, but America still didn't see me. Yet even in silence, they carried something sacred. Their secret, their words, had not just protected soldiers, it had preserved their people. The Navajo language, once banned in schools, had proven itself the strongest weapon the modern world had ever known. It had saved thousands of lives without taking any. It had bridged worlds that had been at war for centuries, the ancient and the modern, the conquered and the conqueror. In the heart of every code talker, that truth burned brighter than any metal. Then, in 1968, 23 years after the war, the secret was finally declassified. For the first time, America learned that its unbreakable wartime code had not come from machines, but from the voices of Native Americans. The story spread quickly. Newspapers called them the living code. The military called them the silent heroes. And the Navajo Nation called them the protectors of both worlds. Recognition came slowly, like dawn breaking over the desert. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as Navajo Code Talkers Day, saying, "The Navajo Code Talkers service will forever stand as a symbol of unity through diversity." In 2021, the remaining survivors were invited to Washington, D.C. to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. As they stood on the steps of the Capitol, old and frail, wearing their red caps and turquoise necklaces, they represented not only victory, but survival. President George W. Bush said, "In war, their words carried courage. In peace, they carry our gratitude." For many of them, it was the first time they had ever been publicly thanked. Some wept, others stood quietly, as they always had. But the recognition was not just about medals or ceremonies. It was about memory, the restoration of a story that had nearly been erased. Before the war, the Navajo language was dying. Children were punished for speaking it. Elders feared it would vanish within a generation. But the Code Talkers had carried it into the heart of the greatest war in history and proved its worth beyond imagination. Their words had guided artillery, directed aircraft, and saved entire divisions. Now those same words were being taught again, not as relics, but as pride. In schools across the Navajo Nation, children began learning the old tongue, reciting the same words their ancestors had whispered through battlefield radios half a century before. Language once forbidden had become freedom again. The last of the original 29, Chester Nez, lived long enough to see the world finally honor his brothers. He often said he didn't need glory. The honor, he explained, was already written in the land itself. "When I speak Navajo," he said, "I can still hear the voices of those who never came home. Their words are in the wind." When he died in 2014, the U.S. Marine Corps draped his coffin in both the American flag and the Navajo Nation flag. At his funeral, an old radio from World War II played a final transmission, a message in Navajo sent by his fellow Code Talkers. "The mission is complete. Rest now, brother." Today, only a handful of Code Talkers remain. They are old men with eyes that have seen too much, but when they speak, the world listens. They tell young Marines that courage can come from anywhere, even from a language that once had no written word. They remind America that strength is not in weapons, but in the people who wield them, in the stories, voices, and histories that endure when everything else burns. And when they speak in Navajo, that rolling, rhythmic, sacred sound, it feels less like memory and more like eternity. Because the code they created was never truly a code. It was a heartbeat, one that carried through fire, across oceans, and into history. It was not invented in a laboratory, nor designed by generals. It was born from the earth, from a people who had survived centuries of silence and turned their survival into victory. The Japanese cryptographers never cracked it because they never could. It wasn't just a language, it was a living nation speaking through its sons. The Navajo Code Talkers did not just help win a war, they proved that words, human, sacred, imperfect words, could be stronger than bullets. Their story remains a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon on earth isn't made of steel, but of voice, memory, and identity. And even now, long after the last radio has gone quiet, the language still carries, across mesas, through canyons, and into the wind. A voice that once saved the world, still whispering in the desert, still unbroken, still alive. Our language was our weapon and our gift.